Welcome to the Great Debate, an always memorable feature of the AJC Global Forum. This year's debate will pit two seasoned experts with sharply different diplomatic approaches against each other on the central question of the most effective means to counter the Iranian nuclear threat, and indeed the multiple threats posed by Tehran to regional and global peace. To set the stage, in 2015, after 2 years of negotiations and a placeholding interim deal, the United States and 5 other world powers announced an agreement with the Islamic Republic of Iran to sharply limit its nuclear program, a program long suspected and later proven in smoking gun detail to have potential destabilizing military applications. In return for certain constraints on its program, Iran won relief from an array of economic and energy sanctions that the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations had imposed. A year after implementation in January 2016 of the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden were out, and President Donald Trump and Vice President Mike Pence were in. And 16 months after that, the United States withdrew from the agreement, later reimposing the sanctions that had been lifted as part of the nuclear deal, and right up until they left office at the beginning of this year, adding further sanctions against Iran. What we'll be debating in this hour with Ambassador Gérard Araud, the veteran French diplomat, and Michael Doran, a scholar with a US national security background, is whether President Biden, who took office in January after promising to return America to the nuclear deal and to seek a longer and stronger agreement, is on the right track or the wrong track in engaging Iran. We're conscious that we're conducting this debate in the wake of several rounds of negotiations in Vienna aimed at restoring the deal, with many details of Iranian constraints and US sanctions relief not yet clear, and with the political ramifications in Washington and internationally still unfolding. But the key questions haven't changed. Is the Iran nuclear deal worth saving? Will it make the Middle East and the world safer? And if the deal falls short of confronting the range of Iranian threats, can it be fixed? We'll begin our debate by asking each speaker to offer an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. We'll then allow up to 2 minutes of rebuttals, after which I'll pose a series of questions to the debaters who will have up to 90 seconds to respond. We'll conclude with 1-minute summations by each debater. Now let's begin with you, Ambassador Araud.
Thank you, Jason. I want to set some basic principles to explain the problem that we are facing and the way we are trying to handle it. The first one is very clearly, we don't trust the Iranians. There is not a question of trusting the Iranians. It's a question of being able to monitor their program, to limit their program. And actually, the deal which had been agreed in 2015 was setting an unprecedented set of limitation and control of the Iran nuclear deal. Never in the history we set such an agreement of arms control, which was so strict, really at the expense, of course, of a country. The second element I would want to insist is that an agreement is a compromise. Of course, we would have preferred to reach an agreement much more stringent. We would have preferred, for instance, to impose on the Iranians giving up enrichment. But an agreement, I said, is a compromise. And at the end of the day, you have to reach a point where you say, deal or no deal, what do you prefer? And we decided that we prefer to have a deal. That's a very important point because, you know, I have always, all my life, I've been a negotiator. And usually when you come back home with an agreement, you have always somebody saying, oh, that's not good. You should have asked that or that. Of course, I had asked that and that, but I didn't get it. So when somebody is saying this agreement is bad, the real question that you have to immediately to give is, what else? What is your solution? And in this case, it's striking that we know what is the alternative because it has been tried by the Trump administration. as Jason has explained, the Trump administration has denounced an agreement which had been signed by the United States of America and has imposed unprecedented sanctions at the expense of Iran. Really, never such sanctions had been imposed on the country. What is the result 3 years later? The result is, of course, that Iran got out of the nuclear deal, and that today we are much closer to a nuclear bomb than we were in 2018. And sooner or later, we will have to answer the question, bombing Iran or the Iranian bomb? Because Iran, contrary to what the Trump administration was trying to get, Iran is not going to surrender. That's a fact. It is showing resilience against all the sanctions and is moving forward to what we could think could be a nuclear weaponry. So the choice, the alternative is clear. Either we are able to limit the nuclear program, or if we don't, we will go to this alternative, bombing Iran or an Iranian bomb. Third point, the real problem in the region is not so much the Iranian nuclear weaponry, but it's the geopolitical imbalance, which is the result of the stupid invasion of Iraq by the Americans. Iraq was balancing Iran. Now it's not anymore the case. So it's obvious that Iran is the big boy on the block, so we should balance Iran. And it means that we should complement the agreement with all a series of other agreements, and especially security guarantee to our friend, the Gulf monarchies. The Europeans were ready to work with the Trump administration on complementing the nuclear deal on the other issue, terrorism, regional activities, and missiles program. We are close to an agreement with the Trump administration, but as you know, suddenly President Trump decided to sweep away everything and to bring us to this crisis. So to conclude, this agreement is not perfect, but this agreement is the only means that we have to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power. And that, of course, it's a critical result, not only for the region, but for the rest of the world. Thank you very much. And I'm ready, of course, to answer to all the questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. Michael, please, your opening statement.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks to the AJC, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Let me start by asking, what are our two major goals with respect to Iran? And they're, number one, to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. And secondly, to prevent Iran from threatening its neighbors through this vast militia network that it has developed. The problem with the JCPOA is that it makes both of those goals impossible. And it was sold to us on the basis of a number of false claims. The most, I think, obviously erroneous claim was that it blocks all pathways to a nuclear weapon. That's simply not true. It's an absolutely indefensible statement, and it's easy to prove. And the key issue is the sunsets. Within less than a decade, by 2031, all of the restrictions on the Iranian nuclear program are going to be lifted. And so Iran is going to have an industrial size enrichment and reprocessing capability under an international guarantee. So the best that could possibly be claimed about the JCPOA is that it gives us about a decade of Iran not developing a nuclear weapon. But if you look closely at the deal, you see that even that statement doesn't hold up, because the Iranian nuclear program is actually not restricted in any significant way. The Iranian nuclear weapons program is not restricted in any significant way by the JCPOA. The JCPOA has very strict limitations on a limited number of factors for a limited amount of time. And it doesn't touch other factors that are other elements of the nuclear weapons program that are very important. For example, again, the most obvious example is the Fordo facility, the mountain bunker outside of Fordo, which we now know was part of a nuclear weapons program. We know that how? Because the Israelis stole from Tehran the nuclear archive, which explained to us exactly how that was part of a nuclear weapons program. The JCPOA, if it was going to give us insurance that Iran was never going to develop a nuclear weapon, should have destroyed the Fordo facility, but it didn't do that. So Iran has a number of other elements like this that it is able to continue to use under the so-called restrictions of the JCPOA, which means that the nuclear weapons program has not gone away, and that for that reason, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association, has never certified the Iranian nuclear program as peaceful. It's not a peaceful program, and all restrictions on it are going to end in a very short period of time, and some of them are ending even before 2031. Now, secondly, the JCPOA is going to funnel to Iran billions and billions over the life of the agreement, hundreds of billions of dollars, which it is going to use to strengthen its militia network all across the region. And this is not a theory. We saw this happen after the original JCPOA was signed. Iran's militia activity increased all around the region. It increased in Yemen. It increased in Iraq. And Iran is developing ever better weaponry to distribute to these militias. And we saw that just recently in the conflict between Hamas and Israel, where Hamas had a much more sophisticated rocket and missile capability than it ever had before. Of course, Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets and missiles, which they are upgrading to precision-guided weaponry. This capability of Iran's is going to grow stronger as a result of the JCPOA. So we are not going to stop the nuclear program, and we are going to strengthen Iran around the region. And so the goals that the ambassador cited will not be achieved. They will actually be impeded by this agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Let me give you an opportunity to counter that, Ambassador.
No, first, I think I was expecting that Mike would tell us what else, what is the alternative. As I have said, it's easy to criticize an agreement which is never perfect, but you have to really to say which other policy could be conducted. Second point, frankly, it's false to say that in 5-10 years, all constraints will be lifted on the Iranian nuclear program, because not only Iran is part of the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but it will have to sign what is called the additional protocol, which is giving additional powers of investigation to the International Agency for the Atomic Energy. And as you know, Mike, the intelligence services of France, Israel, the US, and UK have been totally able to detect any move by the Iranians since 2003 as their nuclear program. So we will have the means, either intelligence, but also control to see what the Iranians are doing. And if they are really going back to a military program, we'll impose sanctions. You know, really, we will be exactly in the same situation. Second point, the money you are referring to is Iranian money. That's not a detail. Third point, as I have said, the European countries, we are ready to work with the US on addressing what is called the other issues of concern, terrorism, regional activities, and the missiles. But the nuclear issue is such complicated, you know, an agreement of 159 pages, that it should be handled as such on its own merit, because we don't want to have to exchange neutral centrifuges against Yemen. So that was necessary first to solve this issue and then to go to the other ones.
Michael, what about that? Your turn.
Thanks. So let me start by saying the alternative. The alternative was the maximum pressure campaign by the Trump administration. To say that it didn't work, as the ambassador has said, is simply not true. It was working extremely well. We have to realize, I think, that maximum pressure was only in place for about 18 months to its full extent. The Trump administration tried, and I'd like to get to this later, but the Trump administration tried to get a longer and stronger agreement, the very thing that the Biden administration says it's going for, during the first 2 years of the administration, and the effort did not work. The allies didn't accept it. The Iranians weren't going to accept it. The Democrats in Congress didn't support it either, really, when we're looking at it. So we only had about 18 months. And during that 18 months, there was unprecedented economic pain was put on Iran. And the Israelis showed, especially, I assume it was the Israelis, an ability to go into any facility in Iran and sabotage it. How much better could they do if the United States, the greatest power on earth, was supporting them? So the claim that the ambassador made, that the choice is between war or the JCPOA, is simply not true. There is an alternative, which is unprecedented economic pressure on them, as well as clandestine operations designed to impede the program. Let me just say one more thing. The NPT, the Iranians are in violation of the NPT now. The Iranians were in violation of the NPT when they concluded the JCPOA. The fact that they kept their nuclear archive was a violation of the NPT. So the idea that we're going to be protected by the NPT in 2031 is simply not credible.
Michael, thank you. I think we can keep rebutting, but let me move on to the next question, and then maybe you'll have a chance to jump into rebutting previous arguments as well. Michael, you just raised the issue of and Ambassador, you referred to it earlier as well, the effort in the early 2 years of the Trump administration to try to bring the Europeans on board, an effort to impose a wider agreement on Iran, or to come to a wider agreement on Iran. Why couldn't, Ambassador, why couldn't the four traditional allies, all equally aware of the multiple threats that Iran poses to regional and global peace, why couldn't they come to a common approach to improve the 2015 agreement?
But we were. Actually, it's very strange because we were working with Secretary Tillerson and his negotiator, Brian Hook. And actually, we were very close to an agreement in May 2018. The only question remaining was the length, the duration of the agreement, but we were looking for solutions. It's simply that overnight, President Trump swept away everything. He was not even aware that there was a negotiation. My president, Emmanuel Macron, called Trump and said, we have a negotiation going on. The answer of Donald Trump was, which negotiation? And President Macron said, conducted by Brian Hook. And President Trump said, who is Brian Hook? There was a negotiation. It was close. We were close to an agreement. You can ask the British, you can ask the Germans or the European Union. It's simply that in this dysfunctional administration, which was the Trump administration, everything, as I have said, was overnight, was swept away without any explanation given to the allies. We have solutions. We have proposals. We were getting close to an agreement.
Michael, let me turn to you with a different question. President Biden and senior administration officials have said repeatedly, as we've been discussing, that they seek a longer and stronger follow-on agreement with Iran that would address a wide range of Iranian actions, in particular its ballistic missile program, its regional aggression, its support for terrorism, as well as ensuring that the nuclear program restrictions don't phase out in a few years' time and that there are adequate inspections. There are two dilemmas that I see. There's the dilemma of how you get to that follow-on agreement after sanctions are lifted, if that's what takes place in the Vienna negotiations that are going on. And the second dilemma that I see, which is there are different agendas that the United States has with China and Russia and France and Germany and the UK. How can the United States convince our negotiating partners on our side of the table to go along with that tougher follow-on agreement? So the Iranian dilemma and also the allies' dilemma, if you will. What do you think, Michael?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand what the JCPOA is and what it isn't. Barack Obama sold it to the American people as a non-proliferation agreement, as a narrow arms control agreement. Joe Biden has returned to those kind of claims. It was never that. As I mentioned, it doesn't actually block the Iranian military program. It limits certain aspects of it for a limited amount of time. So what the JCPOA does do, however, is it moves the nuclear question off to one side to leave space for diplomatic engagement of Iran, which the Barack Obama administration and now the Biden administration want to use in order to stabilize areas like Yemen, Iraq, Syria, and so forth. They actually see Iran as a partner. And this is important for understanding because the JCPOA was an instrument for turning Iran into a partner for stabilizing the region, a role that it can never possibly fulfill. Now, why do all of this has to do with the longer and stronger agreement. The longer and stronger agreement is even a bigger con than the original JCPOA because the JCPOA gives Iran everything it ever wanted. So it takes away all incentive for the Iranians to agree to a longer and stronger agreement. If we go back to the JCPOA or something like it, there will never be a longer and stronger agreement.
Ambassador Araud, do you see it the same way or you have a different view? Can we get to a follow-on agreement that's longer and stronger?
Oh, I'm really, first, the JCPOA was not, intended to make Iran a partner. It was to handle the nuclear issue. And I remember that we had the conversation with the Obama administration, really basically to address the other issues. As I've said, we are facing the geopolitical imbalance of the Middle East because of the destruction of Iraq by the Americans. And Iran is the big boy on the block. That's foreign policy. We have to balance Iran. And that, France has agreements with the United Arab Emirates. We have a military basis in the Emirates, and we have a naval presence there. And I think that the Western powers should work together to reassure our partners. As a longer agreement, I don't know whether, first, I don't even know whether it's possible to go back to the JCPOA, because if I were Iranian, I wouldn't trust the Americans anymore, especially because the Republicans in the Congress are screaming that they will denounce the agreement in 4 years if they win the elections. So I guess that if I were Iranian, I would say, well, the best way is to get the bomb. Basically, look at Ukraine, look at Libya. They gave up the bomb and they were invaded. So let's have the bomb so we can face the Americans.
Let me stick with you, Ambassador, and ask you a different question. What makes you think that diplomacy can arrest Iran's progress toward military nuclear capability when we all know that since the days of the Shah even, the country has been intent on developing such capability? It has a history of bloody conflict with at least some of its neighbors, and it has the homegrown knowledge and the resources to advance a weapons program. Is it conceivable that Iran would give that up?
You can even add that Iran was aggressed by Iraq and was victim of WMD, chemical weapons, in the deafening silence of the West. Diplomacy, it's not really calling for the good faith of the Iranians. Diplomacy is simply really convincing the Iranians that it's their interest. We are talking of interest. It's their national interest to reach an agreement, because really pursuing their military nuclear program is so costly that it could endanger the regime. And the regime had reached, apparently after 10 years, we have tried to get it 10 years to bring the Iranians 10 years to the table. Eventually, they accepted to enter a negotiation and to reach this compromise. Contrary to Mike, I think that it was a good compromise. It was limiting and monitoring the nuclear program. It was the best that we could get. As I've said, it was a compromise. But again, verified. So it means that we don't trust the Iranians, and we should keep not only the regime of international inspections, but also our own intelligence means. And if the Iranians are moving towards a nuclear program, we should react. Sanctions first. We can bring back the sanctions. You leave them, you can bring them back.
Michael, really the same question to you. Is any negotiated agreement with the Iranians, given their interest and their history, is it possible?
So I agree with the ambassador about one thing, and that is that the job of the United States and its allies is to counter the power of Iran. That Iran is, it does have, in comparison to all of the Arab allies of the United States and the Israelis, a unique set of advantages in the geopolitical competition. The JCPOA does not balance Iran. It actually takes American power and shifts it in the direction of Iran. It increases the power of the militia network across the region. It puts hundreds of billions of dollars into the hands of the regime. It's very sad for me to sit here arguing like this opposite a French diplomat, because when I was in the White House in 2006, the very best allies the United States had with regard to Iran were the French. The French were sometimes tougher than we were on the Iranian nuclear question. And what happened was that the JCPOA whipsawed the French, and they were put in a position where they were angering both in trying to hold out against the ridiculous concessions of the JCPOA. They were angering both Tehran and Washington simultaneously, and they were isolated. And so now we have a new French position. That's thanks to the JCPOA, which shifted American power not just toward Iran, but destroyed the coalition that was balancing Iran.
Ambassador, since your country was just discussed, I think you should have an opportunity to respond.
No, it's the JCPOA. We the French, we would have preferred to have some parts of it tougher. It's an open secret that we didn't consider that the negotiation methods of the Secretary of State was the best way to get the best agreement. But at the end of the day, when looking at the text, at the final text, we said it's okay. It's a good agreement. It could have been better on the margins, but that's a good agreement. I insist on that because, again, and I disagree with Mike on that. The Iranians are not going to surrender, because what the Trump administration was asking Iran was basically to surrender. There were 12 demands, and the addition of the 12 demands was surrendering. The Iranian regime has shown an incredible resilience. Of course, the sanctions are very punitive, but the Iranian people are suffering a lot. But the regime has not shown any inclination actually to cave in. And the opposite, they have moved forward. And as I've said, it's a fact. They are closer to the bomb now than they were in 2018. And they're going to get closer and closer. They went to enrichment at 60%. What are we going to do in 6 months or 1 year?
Thank you, Ambassador. Michael, let me come back to you. A different case, North Korea. Reported to have dozens of nuclear warheads, intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the United States. It periodically tests ballistic missiles that could strike U.S. allies and U.S. personnel in South Korea and Japan. It's carried out assassinations abroad, abductions in other countries as well, and it's among the most oppressive regimes on earth. What is the rationale for the United States seeming to focus more attention on the multiple threats posed by Iran than one on the threats that are posed by North Korea, the so-called Hermit Kingdom?
Well, I don't know how to measure that and say that there's more attention paid to Iran than on North Korea. I think we put a lot of attention on North Korea as well. But I think that North Korea should serve as a lesson of the ghost of Christmas future of what happens if the United States does not actually block Iran, both prevent it from getting a nuclear weapon, which, as I said, the JCPOA does not do, and also address the militias that it has proliferated across the region and to which it is distributing precision-guided weaponry. And what I mean by that is look at what North Korea can do. North Korea, the United States could destroy North Korea in a relatively short order and wipe out its entire nuclear arsenal. But there's a cost to that, and the cost is Seoul and Tokyo. So the North Koreans have developed a credible enough threat against those two capitals to prevent us from taking action against them. we're in danger of Iran reaching that capacity. Iran, like I said earlier, has 150,000 rockets and missiles in Lebanon through Hezbollah trained on Israel. You can see the capabilities it's building up in Hamas. Israel defeated Hamas roundly in 2014. Thanks to the Iranians, Hamas now has more sophisticated weaponry. Israel has just defeated Hamas again, and we can assume that they're going to go to work, the Iranians, to give better capacity to Hamas. So what's going to happen is that Israel is going to get surrounded by militias who are going to get ever stronger with this precision-guided weaponry, and they're going to train on Tel Aviv like the North Koreans train on Seoul. And if we have behind that as well a nuclear-armed Iran, that is a disaster.
Michael, thank you. I want to stay in the region now and turn back to you, Ambassador. In 2013 and 2014, 2015, as the United States was coordinating with European allies on the negotiations that resulted in first the Joint Plan of Action and then the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, Israel and America's strategic partners in the Gulf were routinely debriefed on the talks that were taking place with Iran. But those countries which have the most to lose from Iranian aggression and would be in the crosshairs of advanced Iranian weaponry weren't in the room when the deal went down. And they aren't in the room now either. Is that a formula for a more widely accepted deal this time around, or the opposite of such a formula?
No, as I said, I think, and I agree with Mike. I agree that Iran is also really raising a lot of problems, not only with missiles, with weapons, with terrorism, with regional activities in Syria. And we have to complement the nuclear agreement with a wider agreement. And in this case, I think we should work with the countries in the region. Because let's be frank, if we have the Saudis and the Emiratis at the table of nuclear negotiations, they're not going to be concerned by the nuclear problem, but by the conventional problem. That's for them the real threat. And that's something that that's something we could consider that the Obama administration has not addressed it after having signed the agreement, the JCPOA. So let's look at the security arrangement in the region. Why couldn't we have a sort of NATO for the regions with the participation of the Western powers? It's obvious that we have to stabilize it. In any case, the alliance, the enemy of my enemy is my friend is the basis of any foreign policy. The Israelis and the Emiratis and the Saudis have already concluded that they have to work together against Iran. So there is already a sort of balance.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. Michael, let's talk more about the Israeli perspective on all of this. Now, as in 2015, the Israeli government has expressed sharp opposition to the JCPOA, which officials regard as offering a windfall to a regime that has expressed again and again its desire to annihilate Israel. Do you regard Israel's concerns as legitimate, and are strong sentiments from so close an ally reason enough to alter the U.S. approach?
They should be of course they're legitimate. The JCPOA has already served as the starting gun for a very, very dangerous arms race in the region. None of the allies, not the Saudis, not the Israelis, not the Turks, believes that this is actually going to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. They are all looking at other alternatives so that they have that they will be able to meet the challenge coming from a nuclear Iran. We're kidding ourselves. The only people that we have convinced that this is blocking Iran is the left wing of the Democratic Party. Those are the only people who are truly convinced. There are more supporters of the Iranian regime in Washington, D.C. than there are in Iran. The Shiwei Wang, the graduate student from Princeton, who was taken hostage by the Iranians, by the way, immediately after the JCPOA, when the new flowering of cooperation between Tehran and Washington began, said that in his 40 months in Iran, he never met a person who actually supported the regime. So we are strengthening this heinous regime. It's threatening our allies, and we're not listening to them. And the reason for that is that we are really pulling back from the region. It's nice to hear the ambassador say we'll have a NATO and whatnot, but the whole goal of this exercise is to pull America back from the region.
Well, Ambassador, you served in Israel. I think it was your first posting as well as serving as ambassador. What do you say to your Israeli friends who are concerned about these developments in the United States re-entering a pact that they regard as so dangerous?
No, first, of course, it's totally legitimate that Israel expresses its concerns. Its security is directly at stake. And I do remember I was in Israel when Ahmadinejad was elected and was starting to use this horrendous rhetoric about Israel should be swept away from the world map, At the same time, I know very well Israel, and I know very well also the security apparatus. And I'm sure, Jason, so do you, and Mike, and there is a lot actually of Israelis which in private are telling you, former head of the Mossad, I could give names, former head of the Mossad, specialist of nuclear energy from the Israeli Nuclear Energy Agency, who are telling you that actually they consider that this agreement is not that bad, that this agreement is the best one that they could get. And by the way, they are totally able to deter Iran. So it has been obviously, and really it means Israel, I'm not discussing that, but it has been a line of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but it's not a line which is unanimous in the Israeli security apparatus. But in any case, it's very important, and that's what the French we did, to be totally transparent about what we are doing. And we have had a very good intelligence cooperation with Israel on this issue. It's one of these examples where countries have exchanged hard intelligence, which, as you know, it's very rare.
I'm going to conclude with a question to each of you. But let me begin by saying that although it was routinely denied, it was often speculated that the true aim of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran wasn't to force it back to the bargaining table, but to collapse the regime. Ambassador, to you, isn't there a danger that removing the maximum pressure sanctions will have the opposite effect, that it will actually breathe new life into a dangerous regime? And Michael, to you, if regime change was or could be a possibility, what would give us confidence that new leadership in Tehran, after heavy outside pressure, would actually be less threatening than the current regime? Ambassador, for you?
Yes. When Trump denounced the agreement, we asked our ambassadors in Tehran, because we have the advantage, really, to the Americans, we have the advantage of having an embassy there, what was their analysis of the situation? And really the answer was, actually, as Mike said, the regime is extremely unpopular. There were some Iranians saying, "Oh, good, Trump is right to twist the arms of this horrendous regime." But at the same time, the second question was, okay, and if the regime collapses, what will happen? And unfortunately, the answer of our ambassadors was that there is no political force in Iran, there is no personality in Iran which could be an alternative, a democratic or peaceful alternative to the regime, and the danger will be that actually the Pasdaran will take the power, that actually the regime could still be worse than it is. So that's our analysis. We are going to have presidential elections in June, and the risk is actually to have a radical elected, which in a sense will make our conversation useless, because it will mean that the Iranians have themselves decided they don't trust the Americans, and have decided to go to the bomb.
And thank you, Ambassador. Michael, a question about the possibilities of an alternative regime, if that could even be achieved.
I think that there's a consensus in American politics today that our policy on Iran should focus on behavior change and not regime change. Having said that, I think we can probably, I agree with what the ambassador said, that they are not going to give up. But I would say the following: they're not going to give up their military nuclear program. They have taken so much pain in order to hold on to that military nuclear program. We should draw the proper conclusion. Now, maximum pressure held out the possibility of putting them under absolutely enormous pressure, where they had to make the decision between regime survival and their nuclear weapon. That's what we have to do. We have to put them before that dilemma. We know what it looks like when governments give up nuclear programs. We've seen it in the past, in South Africa, in Taiwan, in other countries. And the picture that is coming out of Iran is not a government that has given that up. And in fact, it's been incredibly tenacious about it. So the choice between us is either do everything we can to weaken them, to put them before a clear choice between survival and their nuclear program, or to ensure that if they do go nuclear, they are as weak as possible and pay the absolutely highest price for it, or we have to take military action. Those are the choices given the nature of this regime. To pretend that if we funnel hundreds of billions of dollars to it and negotiate with it, we're going to get a better result just defies all common sense.
Thank you, Michael. We're not going to move into closing statements by each of you. We'll give each 1 minute to make a final argument. And although, Michael, I think I've heard echoes of what that closing statement might be just now, I would like you to try to sum it up in 1 minute.
Oh, yeah, starting with me. Yeah, sorry.
Starting with you.
Yes, you're right. You did hear closing. You did hear echoes of my closing statement. My closing statement is it's just common sense that if we funnel hundreds of billions of dollars to this regime, while also reaching out to it and insisting that our allies reach out to it to negotiate over places like Yemen, which the Biden administration is doing right now, we are only going to strengthen it. We are only going to encourage it to use its militia capacity in order to inflict greater damage on our allies and to extract greater concessions from us. This is just common sense on the basis of the nature of what this regime is. The Biden policy and the Obama policy is appeasement, pure and simple. And the reason people appease regimes like Iran is they don't want to face up to the very difficult dilemmas that exist, and they don't want to see the real hard options that we have, and they want to pretend that there's some easy way to get out or nice way to get out of this.
Michael, thank you very much. Ambassador Araud, your closing argument.
Well, thank you very much. No, first, really, as I have already said, and I think Mike has confirmed it, really the alternative to negotiating with Iran. I remind everybody that you negotiate with bad guys by definition. You don't negotiate with Norway. You negotiate with Iran. You negotiate with China. You negotiate with Russia. Diplomacy is to talk to a bad guy. But I agree with Mike that if we don't have an agreement with the Iranians, it will mean that at the end of the day, we will face the moment where the Iranians have the bomb or are on the point of having the bomb, and which means the alternative of bombing Iran or the Iranian bomb. That's the debate. I'm not sure that the JCPOA will prevent this alternative, but this alternative is so horrendous that I think we have to do everything we can to avoid it.
Ambassador Araud, thank you. Michael Doran, thank you. That concludes this year's great debate. Thank you, AJC Global Forum participants, for joining us for the great debate. And I'd like you to please stay with us for further Global Forum programming. Thank you.